the world had seen many scientific revolutions, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in China, famously, in 9th century, 10th century Baghdad, 13th, 14th century Paris and Oxford. All of them are kind of nascent scientific revolutions that could have transformed the world, and none of them did. Now, the one that happened in the 17th century emphatically did, and it's very telling that the reason it did was because it was justified on explicitly theological grounds. If you go back to someone like Francis Bacon, writing at the beginning of the 17th century, he justifies science, which of course is called natural theology, on specifically biblical grounds. So I think one of the pushbacks I would have is that the book doesn't quite sufficiently acknowledge that as a development from Christendom, which is not simply a cultural development, but is actually a theological development.
Well, it's that was the water that everyone swam in. I mean, that was the air that they breathed. So everything had to be justified in terms of the belief systems that were common ground among the people of the era. And since it only happened once, we can't look at the full range of civilizations that had scientific revolutions, or at least ones that persisted versus ones that don't test the hypothesis that specifically Christian ideas were a prerequisite to the scientific revolution.
But see, to push back on that, I think you can, because you have the counterexamples of China, which famously Joseph Needham spent a lifetime studying. Why China, this amazingly technologically developed nation, or state for the sake of arguments, much more so than Europe, didn't translate that technological development into a full-scale scientific revolution. And he comes to the conclusion, and others following him have agreed, that it was a lack of what Christians would call a doctrine of creation. We needn't go into that now. That as it were, didn't provide the soil for the scientific revolution to happen. So actually, I think there are counterfactuals that you can cross-compare. And one of the distinctive factors is the Christian doctrine of creation that legitimized and encouraged the study of the natural world as a way of understanding and glorifying God.
But the same counterfactual would have to ask, since that was imminent in Christianity from the start, why did it take 1,200 years if those ideas were there all along? So it's very hard for things that happened only once. Yep. I mean, you can try to come up with the counterfactuals, and of course, every idea has numerous tendrils and roots and influences and tributaries. So it's certainly possible that Christianity was part. I mean, it undoubtedly was part of the context. Whether it was causal, I think, is harder to establish.
Of course, I mean, causality in history is really tough. But I think the scientific revolution is a fascinating example of Christianity both being kind of a catalyst and also a foe. So the catalyst for was, as I've said, a lot of theological argument, but the reason it happened in, say, 1600 or slightly later, as opposed to 1500, was because Europe had dragged itself into this massive epistemological crisis in the Reformation, where Catholics fought Protestants and they undermined one another, and in the end, the arguments that had been thoroughly sort of strong in 1500 were much weaker in 1600. So, as it were, Christianity created the problem for which it also created the solution. History is a real mess.